And welcome to the Deep Connect Show, the place to help you feel deeply connected to yourself, your desires, and in those juicy relationships of yours. I'm your host, Raven, and today it's all about bringing the experts to you. I'm here with one of the most influential community members in the area of love, relationships, and intimacy. And just because I want you to experience a greater level of intimacy and juiciness in your life, which is achievable and sustainable in an everyday way, I want to introduce you to sex educator Wahila Wilkie. And Wahila Wilkie is one of the most compassionate, pleasure-filled humans I know. Welcome to the show, Wahila.
Thank you,
Thank you so much for being here. And I know that you know the ins and outs and routes to deep, rich connection. So I'm just really grateful to be able to pick your brain and your heart.
Glad to be here.
And you know, when it really boils down to feeling really connected with myself, I really look towards you and I observe you, and I really look to you as a mentor of feeling deeply connected, because I see how you articulate, you're able to really identify your needs and articulate requests. And I really admire that about you. Is that something that you've always been really skilled at? And if you haven't, has there been any events in your life that really shifted that, where you felt like you needed to craft that?
Definitely that is not a skill I always had. Even as late as 29 or 30 years old, that was not a skill that I had. But about then, I became aware that men in particular really love to know what a woman wants. And in order to give them that information, a woman needs to know what she wants. And so I had to do a little battle with myself, because I had really grown up not being asked what I wanted. And so at that point in my life, I was really much more aware of what I didn't want. And that's helpful, but it doesn't allow us to make really good requests.
Yeah.
And so I had to spend quite a bit of time with myself, really getting clear about what it is I want, and then learn to communicate that from a very I place, what I would like, and also learn to kind of course correct in a loving way.
This is what you do so well that I've observed in you, to be able to do that in such a loving way. And I even loved how you said, men love to fulfill our requests, right? Because some women, I've heard us talking, that sometimes that's a frustrating experience. And sometimes we'll just say that, like, men don't know what I want, or so even just what you just said, and turning it into, they really do love to hear what we want, and that our work that we can do in meeting that middle ground is to identify our needs, so that we can have that experience that you're talking about just now.
Yeah.
And I know that you have had some tragedy in your life, and one of the other things I love about you is you just love life. Like, whenever I connect with you, you're just like, yeah, life is miraculous and it's amazing. So how did you convert these obstacles, and would you be willing to talk about some of those experiences and how it's able to be fuel for living an extraordinary life?
I grew up in a pretty dysfunctional household. Alcoholism was a part of my childhood. Ended up with the death of one of my parents when I was 15. And fortunately, I came in touch with a woman who gave me probably the best guidance of my life at that young age, which was, she told me that I didn't get to choose what happened to me in my life, but I got to choose what I made of it, and what decisions I made around who I wanted to become as a result of that. And that has really been the guiding thing in my life, is knowing that I really do get to choose what I make of the experiences that I have. And at that point in my life, even as young as 15, I really decided to become a compassionate, loving person. And I continue to work on honing that.
Yeah. Well, you must have not had anger and resentment then, because how can you be compassionate? Right?
Oh, no.
Okay, my only block to this compassion and kindness and understanding is when I'm pissed off. So, has that ever happened to you? What did you do with any anger or resentment? I mean, come on. I mean, losing a parent, there's got to be some anger and resentments come up.
I think that one of the things that happens to us is we become afraid of our own anger. And I remember that was true for me, that I had a lot of kind of bottled up anger, and I was so afraid to just let it out and go into it, because in my childhood, when other people were angry, it was dangerous. Yeah. And so I remember a specific time and place when I was really frightened to go into anger and really feel it. But somebody who I trusted encouraged me to just dive in and promised me that I would come out the other side safe. And so in a safe environment, I just let myself go into this anger and screamed and cried and pounded pillows. And lo and behold, I came out the other side. And that was a huge learning to me. And so sometimes when I'm really angry, I get out the pillows and scream
and let it out.
And
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Fuck you.
Yes, I'm a big believer in this.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think this is what cars are made for, actually, when we're driving alone in the car. I think it gives me full permission to just cuss it out.
Yeah.
And it does, it helps. And then I arrive, here at the station and can look very sweet.
And did you have something going on the way here?
No, this time it was great. But I'm just saying, it's an opportunity to let it out.
That's the key to emotions in general, especially the emotions we call the negative emotions, is to quit resisting them and actually feel them. When I feel sad, I just break down and cry and let myself have that feeling fully, and then it moves through, and then I can come back to my own innate state, which is happiness.
Yeah. I'd like to address this crying, because I think that it's big for women who especially, and men, of course, but I know through my own journey, I was so embarrassed because I cried at almost every situation, every scenario. I remember crying in front of employers and bosses and just being, feeling really shameful about it. And now I actually just call it a crying meditation because I just realize that it's an intelligence to have, and it's a skill that I have that other people now approach me and say, how do you access your emotions like that so freely? Did you have a similar process in allowing yourself to cry?
Actually, I kind of came from the other end of the spectrum. As a child, I was punished for having emotions, and so I learned to contain everything. And so I was a person who hated to cry in front of people and never would cry in front of other people. Yeah. And for me, crying in front of other people is a form of intimacy for me. And the safer that I feel with people, the more I'm willing to just open up and let that flow. But I also have learned the value of it anyways. And so, I went through a very rough breakup about 5 years ago, and I was really, really grieving. A lot of stuff was going on in my life that was very painful. And so what I would do is I would kind of contain that all day, because I had to keep putting one step in front of the other. I had to go to work. I had to do all the things. But every night during that time, I would get into bed, and then I would just cry. And just cry and cry and cry and empty out. And I did that day after day until it finally finished.
And it does dissipate. I mean, it doesn't feel like it will in the moment. It feels very overwhelming. But that's also what I learned, is that it does dissipate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It dissipates if we give it its place. As long as we resist it, it is not going to dissipate, and it's just going to show up in other strange, weird, unexpected, and unhealthy ways.
So I would even go as far as to say that it's an amazing way to feel deeply connected with yourself. And speaking of intimacy too, why would somebody want to improve intimacy in their life? Like, what can it bring to someone's life?
Intimacy is all about connection. And when we share deeply and intimately with one another, when we share the parts of ourselves that are frightening for us to share, we become deeply connected. And we build trust, and that opens up a whole new field for us. And many times in relationships, when we risk and share those things, not only do we build connection, but we also build a safe place for the other person. And so we begin a process with each other where we begin to radically increase the level of safety that we each feel with one another.
Yeah, and what stood out to me is when you said each other, because I lived such a large portion of my life isolated, alone, and I did not grasp the concept that there could be other people in my life that I could, but I just didn't have the tools until now to have that intimacy, you know, to invite other people in and to ask, hey, can I cry with you for 5 minutes, for 5 or 10 minutes? And so I would say for me, you know, bringing more intimacy in your life, it allows you to connect with a lot more people. And it's super scary at first. Do you agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also then as we become more comfortable with that, then we can become a doorway for other people. When we share intimately and vulnerably in places like our workplaces or our community, and other people who are afraid of that see us do that, it gives them permission and allows them a place to tell their painful stories.
How have you integrated intimacy in places like work? Because this is a touchy subject. How do we bring it into our everyday practical existence? Is it possible?
I think that's somewhat dependent on where you work, but I think you can always be looking for, with compassionate eyes, who around you is suffering. How can you open up a space for them to share about what they're suffering? And a certain amount of stop hiding our own suffering. I remember when recently when the Dallas shootings happened, I was at work and the news came on my computer, and I just stood in my cube and I cried because it was so painful to me. And people were walking by and they were like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, this is really, really painful." And so I was just transparent and authentic and vulnerable in that moment. And I think that that was very eye-opening to some of my colleagues. And it was great because it wasn't about them and it wasn't about me and it wasn't about something that happened at work. It was about something at large in the world.
But you said something key. Someone asked you how you were doing, and you say, sometimes you'll say, "I'm not doing okay."
I'm not doing okay.
And that is just a huge obstacle to overcome. Just that alone is just tuning in and not saying yes when we mean no, especially in the workplace. Because what are some things that we can say, you know, I think it's great to just say, "No, I'm not okay." Sometimes people don't know how to handle that, but it's the truth. What's your experience at work when you've used that? Is it?
Well, actually, that particular time really opened up a conversation in that organization to why is it that we kind of put on the work face when there's something so painful happening in our world. And it actually made the aftermath of that experience was that managers in our organization were actually counseled to be more sensitive and maybe even
Wow.
check in with their employees
Yeah.
if there's one of those horrible big world events, and see who might need to take time off and do self-care in those
Wow.
moments.
What an opportunity to shift the environment at work just by being authentic, you know, and connecting with yourself.
Yeah, and not everybody has that opportunity. We have to respect that. Not every workplace is as
Yeah.
progressive and friendly as where I work.
Yeah.
So, you know, in those places you can just start with any other person. If you notice that somebody's suffering and can offer them an ear, say, gosh, you look really sad today. Is there anything I can do for you? Be willing to listen
Yeah.
when other people are in pain.
Yeah, and you know, we think that it would be either, it would be a little bit harder to do at work than when we're at home in our relationships. But what I found is that when I can practice it in every area of my life, because it can be just as difficult to be that intimate with a partner at home, and especially in the area of sex. So it's like, just practicing that muscle of being authentic and working on intimacy. And speaking of relationships and sex and how intimacy definitely plays into being sexual, what 3 words would you describe, use to describe your sex life now?
My sex life is juicy, vibrant, and honest.
Ooh. And what advice would you give to anybody out there who's looking to juice it up in their sex life?
Oh, I have so much advice. But one of the things is, if you're not very experienced around sexuality, take a class. We live in the Bay Area where there are tons of resources. So learn about sexuality, because, you know, if you wanted to learn Italian and you didn't know how, you wouldn't just expect to kind of find an Italian person and try and talk with them and learn very quickly. I mean, you would over time, right? But it's clumsy and it's clunky. If you want to learn about sex, find a class, take a class.
Meetup. I've found some groups on Meetup.
Right.
And you are actually a community leader, and we've met at the Human Awareness Institute. And just very briefly, in about a minute, would you be able to describe what the Human Awareness Institute has brought to your life?
The Human Awareness Institute is an amazing organization. They put on the workshops on love, intimacy, and sexuality. So we examine the connection of these very important parts of our life. And the container that's created there is incredibly safe. The focus is on love, on creating more love in our lives, in our world. And given that we're all in bodies, there's an element of sexuality for most of us. And so we explore that element in the workshops as well. And there's sex education built into the workshops.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you again for being you out in the community and being a sex educator, because it's really about intimacy and relating and connecting with people. You know, it's not just about sex. And so it's just, and the way that you do it is just so compassionate and graceful, and it's so amazing to be around. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and just being in my life too.
Thank you, Raven. Thank you for shining a light in the world.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. But I want to thank you for going deep with us today. And join us from future episodes on dating, communication, and ways to get more touch in your life. I'm Raven, and remember, deep connection is the life fulfillment you've been looking for. Thank you.